If you're tuning in online, welcome. If you happen to be visiting this morning, welcome to ABC. We are walking through the Bible in a year, so if you've got your Bible, go ahead and pull it out and open to the book of Job. Just a nice little lighthearted read this morning. It's going to be uplifting, I promise. Whew. Yeah, we're going to take a look at Job together. Søren Kierkegaard is a 19th century philosopher and theologian. He once said that if he were allowed to prescribe just one remedy for all the ills of society, it would be silence. Which is a strong statement anywhere or any place, but if you think about the fact that he said that and wrote that in the 1800s and drop him into 2026 and imagine the context, this guy's mind would be spinning to see the pace and the volume of our culture, and yet he said the remedy for the ills of society would be silence. It's not how I would define the utility of silence. I'm not sure if I asked you, you might say, yeah, I think silence is probably helpful for instruction. You know, you're quiet and you can learn. It's better that you stay silent. It's good to keep from incrimination. You know, like the more you say, the worse hole you sometimes dig yourself in. Silence could be constructive for discipline, spiritual discipline or interpersonal discipline, that there may be some health to us being silent for our own good, for our own soul. Silence could certainly become a weapon. Anybody the recipient of the silent treatment recently? It's been weaponized, maybe on the way to church. Too soon for a couple of you. But I doubt that silence would be defined, at least in my mind, maybe for you, but at least in my mind, I doubt that silence would typically be defined as healing. That's just not the first thing I think about. And yet, when I read the book of Job, as I have last couple of weeks, just try to read this book and ask, God, what are you teaching us? What are you doing in Job's life that you might want to do in our life? I realize there's so much about the healing of silence in this book. The art of well-timed, well-intentioned silence as we read about it in Job. And yes, we're studying the book of Job. If you are visiting or you're new to ABC or you weren't following along in the reading plan, or you haven't heard of Job, Job is a guy who's very, very wealthy. He had thousands of acres of land, had hundreds and thousands of herds of livestock. He had 7 boys and 3 girls, and they all had their households. He's very, very wealthy, very, very righteous, and he lost it all in an instant. And apparently, according to this book, God sits by and allows for it to happen. It's very confusing as we read the book of Job. If you are following along in the reading plan and you've been reading already this week most of Job, you might be wondering why in the world we abruptly exited Genesis. We stopped at chapter 11, jumped all the way into Job, and then we're going to go back. And the reason is because there's no real good place to put the book of Job in a chronological reading plan. We don't know the specific dates and details, and so there's a lot of scholars and historians that have done better work than me at trying to ask the question, where's this book placed and why? And they look at things like the agrarian society and culture that Job lived in. They look at the patriarchal arrangement of his household. They look at the names of the tribes that attacked the family of Job and look at even the names of some of his kids, and they try to make an assessment, and it appears as you kind of study all those surrounding historical data that Job probably took place prior to the Abrahamic covenant, which is in Genesis chapter 12, and we'll be back there next week. So we're pausing Genesis, jump to Job, and then back to Genesis. In case it feels a little bit chaotic, that's why we're doing it that way. And this morning, although many of you haven't finished reading Job, we're going to cover the entirety of the book because next week we got a lot of work to do getting back into Genesis. So that's where we are, like it or not. We're looking at Job. And then the other question comes as you read it, is this even a real guy? Or is this just some kind of like metaphorical parable in order to teach us a lesson? And I believe he is a real historical character. I think these events actually did happen and were transpired. But as I read it from start to finish, you kind of get this meta-narrative approach. You read the whole thing. I do start to realize that this book is the beautiful kind of artistic, poetic work that has a lot of just very clear language of the character of God, of who God is. There's a really neat kind of arrangement as it relates to kind of the call and response. The literature's just outlined in a really compelling way. And you even kind of see like this courtroom setting where you have a judge and a justice and an advocate, and you have the accuser and the accused. And so this thing kind of plays out in a very, really artistic, theatrical kind of way. And so you could say, well, I get why you put Job next to Psalms, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes, because really it is a poetic kind of wisdom literature as opposed to a historic document. It doesn't read like a historic document as you kind of read it. So then we start to ask, okay, well, if it's poetic and there's some real lessons to learn, what do we get from the theme? Like, what is the theme of Job? James chapter 5, verse 11 in the New Testament kind of validates this inclusion of the book of Job. And he says this, as you know, we consider blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. So James starts to draw a conclusion about the theme of Job. And we could probably list a whole bunch of themes. Maybe you've got some listed in the margins of your Bible after reading. You're already starting to glean some of these key takeaways, like perseverance through suffering, as James says, or maybe a theme for you is just God is God and I am not. You have this line in here, he gives and takes away, so be it. That's kind of the sentiment that you see at the end of the day. Or God's truth and justice are not dependent on my definition of truth and justice. That could be a pretty clear theme, takeaway. Man's perspective is always shaded with presumption and subjectivism. We as human beings never see the big picture. You could draw that conclusion pretty easily. I'm also tempted as you read through this account of just intense suffering, I'm tempted to ask some of the harder questions of life in general, like why does a good God allow suffering? Why do bad things happen to good people, right? These age-old questions. And unfortunately, the book is inconclusive. There isn't clarity. You don't get to the end of the book and go, oh, okay, now I understand human suffering. Thank you for including that in the Bible. It just leaves us hanging. However, one of the most significant lessons I think that we can glean as a church this morning in reading the book of Job is a lesson of silence, is a lesson of the humility that's represented by silence. This is a book of humility. So I want to spend a few minutes just exploring the silence of everybody involved in the book, and we'll start with Job's friends. The silence of Job's friends. And I know what you're thinking. You read the book, and you're thinking, these guys were anything but silent. For 17 chapters, they go on indicting him, rebuking him, spewing stuff. Some of it's not even true. And that is the majority of the book, but it's what happens at the beginning that I'm so compelled by in chapter 2 that I want to hone in on. So open your Bibles, Job chapter 2, verse 11, I want to read what takes place right here at the beginning. And this scene follows the tragedy that fell on Job's household. So he's just lost everything. And now he's sitting there just utterly destroyed. Like his wealth is gone, his family's gone, his livestock is, everything's gone. And enter Job's friends. Chapter 2, verse 11 says, now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him, and they raised their voices and wept. And they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was great. This is a really good lesson in friendship and lament. There's a lot of truth here. Look at the end of verse 11. They made an appointment. Which, just imagine the scene for a second. This is the ancient Eastern world, so it's not as if there was a group chat. You know, you just jump on and like hit a couple of the friends and say, hey, we should go check on Job. Did you hear what happened to him? No, they had to travel. So one friend travels to another friend, and he gets there and says, hey, Eliphaz, you going to go see Job? He goes, yeah, I think I'm going to go see Job. And they say, we should probably go get Zophar too. So they go get Zophar. These guys work together in order to demonstrate their sympathy to Job. It shows intention. It shows purpose, which is a really good thing to do as a friend. They're off to a great start. They're going to go comfort their friend. Have you been the recipient of these kind of friends? In your moment of pain or trial or tragedy, in your moment of crisis, have you had friends that showed up? Have you been a friend that showed up? Maybe 2 or 3 friends even, and you realize later, hey, they actually called one another and said, we're all going to go together. It's as if they knew there was something happening. Hey, are you going to go see Jeff? Yeah, I'm going to go see Jeff. Let's go together. We're going to go together to see Jeff. I hope that at some point you've been that kind of friend to someone else, but there's a really helpful call here by these friends that's helpful for us to kind of think about why this is so important. And I think there's 2 reasons. One is in that environment, in that situation, everyone assumes that someone else is going. Or that's the first assumption. The excuse kind of goes like this: I bet that he has better friends than me. Or I bet she has a closer friend. I shouldn't be or wouldn't be the one to go be with this person in their trial or tragedy. This is one way that we excuse, not for ill intent, just literally saying, I don't know if I'm the person that should go. The second problem, the second assumption that we make is, I'm sure that they want their space. I'm sure that they just need some peace or quiet. And I don't think either of those are hardly ever true. So my encouragement to you, just a side note from the book of Job, from his friends, is go. If there's ever a question, if there's ever an opportunity, do you think I should go? Do you think I should call? Do you think I should be there for that service or for that person who just found out that news about their health? I don't know. I don't know if they want me there. I don't know if I'm the right person. Yes, you're the right person. God put it on your heart. You should go. That's one of the key takeaways, because most often these assumptions are not true. And then when they arrive, there's some pretty clear evidence of the way that they demonstrated that love. It says, then they raised their voices and wept. This is verse 12. And they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven, and they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was great. They wept, they tore their clothes, they put dust on their head toward heaven, they sat on the ground. Now, these are Hebrew traditional grieving lament behaviors. I'm not suggesting you go tear clothes in front of people. It's just not something we typically do in our context. But there are some really helpful things in understanding this tradition. We have a lot to learn from the Hebrew tradition, or really any Eastern tradition of lament and mourning, because we just don't do it very well. So let's look at what they're doing and ask, can we stand to be better friends in a moment of grief and lament? They wept, they tore their clothes, they put dust. These are all things outlined in the Old Testament and other places. You find the tradition of lament in Lamentations chapter 2, sitting in silence is listed there. Joshua chapter 7 talks about putting dust on your head. Genesis chapter 37, tearing your clothes. So these are things that happen all throughout the Old Testament. We'll see this again as we walk through the Old Testament teaching. But what's most intriguing to me is that they sit for 7 days and 7 nights in silence on the ground. When's the last time you sat on the ground for like an hour? Like maybe an afternoon, and then you get to the evening time, and then it's like, well, let's just stay here tonight. So you're there overnight, and you get up in the morning, it's like, that's day 2. You got 5 more. My back is already hurting just to think about this right now. To sit on the dust of the ground, weeping, and no one spoke a word for 7 days, sitting in silence. Can you sit with your friends? Will you sit with your friends, your family, in their questions, in their pain, the grief that they have, their moment of loss or tragedy, and not say anything? Another one of the excuses we use, right? I don't know what I would say if I went to see them now. Can I just recommend silence? You don't need to say anything. Just go and be present. And don't get me wrong, these guys are not the hero of the story. If you keep on reading, their ignorance does not help the situation. In fact, the support and solidarity that they show to Job kind of stops right here in chapter 2, and that's sort of the end of it. Their foolish words ensue. They attempt to explain Job's suffering. They really explain it inadequately. In fact, a lot of what they said is just flat out wrong and false, which just adds to his pain. And we get up to chapter 13, and Job says this is really funny. He says, "Oh, that you would keep silent." Can we go back to the 7-day thing of the not talking? Remember the not talking part? That was really good. But notice that they are not the ones to break the silence. Also very helpful. They let Job lead the way here. In chapter 3, verse 1, after the 7 days, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. He's hurting. And we embark on this journey from here as you continue to read, a journey of accusation, of deliberation. It's like a trial, as I mentioned, that plays out in a courtroom scene. But the judge and the justice in the courtroom also remains silent. Job's friends aren't the only ones who stay silent. God, who presides over this whole scene, also stays silent. Look at Job chapter 30, verse 16. I want to read another short passage here. This is Job speaking. In verse 16 it says, "And now my soul is poured out within me. Days of affliction have taken hold of me. The night racks my bones, and the pain that gnaws me takes no rest. With great force my garment is disfigured. It binds me about like the collar of my tunic. God has cast me into the mire, and I've become like dust and ashes. I cry to you for help, and you do not answer me. I stand, and only you look at me." Do you hear what he's saying? And there's several other verses. God, I'm speaking, I'm asking, I'm waiting, I'm listening. Will you please speak? Can you please give me some clarity here? Give me some direction. Why is this happening? Why aren't you answering me? God stays quiet for even longer than the friends, longer than the 7 days. We have a God who's quick to listen and slow to speak, and Job's cries are met by the silence of God. Job chapter 13 says, "Then call and I will answer, or let me speak and you reply to me." I'm going to talk, God, and I want you to talk back, please. Zophar, his friend, even says, "But oh, that God would speak and open his lips to you, Job. Why isn't God answering you? What have you done wrong, Job?" God remains silent. Why does God sit silent through Job's suffering? The truth is we don't know. And it's maybe one of the hardest truths and difficult tensions that sit with us when we read through an account of suffering this way. Why does God stay silent? We don't know. The problem of pain is this philosophical debate that's been happening for centuries. There's a lot that's been dialogued, written, articulated about it. We don't have time to dive too deep into a lot of those arguments. That would take us months. But I want to just make 2 brief points regarding the problem of pain. And the first is that the goodness of God is not dependent on our understanding of his goodness. The goodness of God does not rise and fall on how well you understand goodness. That's a hard truth, but it's true. God is not dependent on you defining his goodness for him. C.S. Lewis has done a lot better work in this than I ever will. He wrote a book called The Problem of Pain, and he starts with this problematic presumption. So he basically says, here's the premise that we start with, and here's why that's a challenge. And our premise is this: if God were good, he would wish to make his creatures perfectly happy, and if God were almighty, he would be able to do what he wished. Makes sense, right? If God's good, he wants his creation to be happy. And if he's powerful, he has perfect power to make us happy. So why doesn't God make us happy? Because wouldn't a good God who's capable be able to make his creatures happy? And so he answers the presumption with a question. So Lewis asks, is it possible for a God to create man with free will, but at the same time withhold it? Is it possible for there to be impossibilities with God? He says, there are therefore impossibilities even for God who can do the impossible. It's like the childhood question we used to ask, is God able to make a rock too big for him to lift? Remember this? No, he can't make a rock too big for him. There are impossibilities even with an all-powerful, sovereign, omnipotent God, which means our definition of omnipotence in this case needs to improve. We need to redefine our understanding of what it means to be all-powerful. We live in a natural world where there's cause and effect, and that's based on the premise of free will, which means that God is decidedly not dictating human behavior. If he were, then yeah, he could just make everybody do whatever he wanted them to do, but that's not the way God created the world. So Lewis continues, try to exclude the possibility, therefore, of suffering, which the order of nature and existence of free wills involve, and you find that you have excluded life itself. You can't take away the possibility of suffering when you have a God who's created a natural order based on human free will. And so he says reconciling human suffering with a loving God is dependent only, therefore, on our definition of love. What does it mean that God actually loves us? Presuming that God's love is content with us as we are is to ask God to cease being God. God ought not reconcile himself to our present impurities. He doesn't have to change or mold to become like what we define him to be. And that's a helpful argument. Like I said, I wish we could dive deeper in that because I might have just made more questions for you, and that's okay. We could process those later. The challenge I have with Lewis's whole argument is, as it relates to the book of Job, it leans towards motive. So basically, there are one or two motives here. One is that the reason God's allowing the suffering is, A, it's a natural result of sin or the fall. And in Job's case, that doesn't seem to be true because Job was a righteous man and these are not consequences for his sin. They're not natural consequences of what he did. It's even at the very end of the book, God says Job is blameless. So it doesn't seem to be that. The second motive could be that God is allowing suffering for the purpose of building character, strengthening character, right? And that doesn't seem to be the case either because he talks about the righteousness of Job in the beginning of chapter 1, how there's no other man on the face of the earth that's as good and solid and robust as this guy, Job. So that doesn't seem to be it either, that God is trying to test Job and refine his character. So then we have to kind of move beyond that argument and we get to point 2, which is that the motive behind God's timing and action does not need an explanation. Another hard truth, but it's the truth. We don't need to come up with a motive as desperately as we want one and as helpful as it would be to kind of keep God in this nice little tidy box. If I could just understand why, God, if I could just get the motive, everything would be fine. Just tell me why you're doing what you're doing. And God's saying, you don't need to know. Sorry, my ways are higher than yours. My thoughts are higher. As high as the heavens are above the earth, so are my thoughts above yours. So we understand God doesn't need a reason to do anything. He doesn't need to justify his actions or his motive to us. And the questionable motive, this is where we have a really hard time. Questionable motive does not erode God's character. Just because you can't define the motive and understand why he did what he did, that doesn't change his character. The prevailing message of Job is God and I'm not. Paul understands this as he writes his letter to the church in Rome. Romans chapter 9, verse 14. What shall we say then? Is there injustice on God's part? By no means. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So then it depends not on human will or exertion. Love that. It's not dependent on human will. It's only dependent on God who has mercy. And in the book of Job, God remains silent for 37 chapters. And that's hard for us because we want to know why he allows this suffering to go on. And when he speaks, finally, at the end of the book, his message is clear. Job, my friend, you were not there at the beginning of creation. You do not understand the weight and the complexity of managing and sustaining the universe. I'm sorry. So you, my friend, do not need an explanation. Why is God silent through Job's pain? It's above my pay grade to answer. Fortunately, we don't know. But if I had to take a stab at it, if I had to, as I read this book and reread it and ask, what are you doing here, Lord? What are you trying to teach us about his life and our lives and what it means to suffer in the midst of silence? If I had to come up with a conclusion, my hypothesis is that God allowed Job to vent and spew and dump for 16 chapters so that he could hear himself. God allowed him to go on. Go on, Job. Get it all out, buddy. Keep going. What else do you think? What else do you feel? Keep going, Job. Let it out. My assumption is that God is allowing Job to get this all out because God knew the quality of Job's faith. He knew of Job's confusion. He knew of the questions Job might have had about the universe. He knew Job's indignation towards his friends and some of the challenges that he would have interpersonally with his friends. He knew what it meant to live a righteous life. He knew that Job was blameless, but maybe Job needed to know these things about himself. Maybe he needed to say it out loud and go, oh, I didn't realize I felt that way. Is that true? Do I really feel that? Get it out, Job. So like a great therapist, God kept quiet and he listened. And I imagine that in the mind of God, he's watching this play out and he would say to Job, I'm making an inference here. Just go with me on it. This isn't extracted from scripture, nor is it backed by any other Bible scholar, so take it or leave it. My assumption is God could have said to Job something like this. I knew how you really felt, but now you know how you really feel. I knew the quality and the resilience of your faith and of your soul, but now you know the quality and the resilience of your soul. I knew how strong your faith was. I knew how you could endure. I knew how hard you've worked to maintain righteousness. But now you know, Job, you've said it. You've articulated it. You finally got to the point where you're able to admit some of the hardship you have with the way the universe works. I knew it, but now you know it. And finally, after God speaks, we're faced with the silence of Job. We have Job's friends starting off with silence. We have God sitting silent for 37 chapters, and now we're met with the silence of Job. Let me read for you chapter 40, verse 3. Then Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, and I will not answer. Twice, but I will proceed no further. I'm done. I spoke my mind, but now I'm going to be quiet. I get it, God. I will keep quiet. St. John of the Cross once said that silence is the first language of God. And I don't think that he meant God would most often stay silent or that we ought to most often stay silent. I think what he meant is the first language of God, the introduction to communicating with God is silence. That at the beginning of our understanding of God is silence. That when we sit in silence for long enough to learn, to process, to grieve, to pray, that's when we begin to communicate with God in more profound ways. God has spoken in this case, according to Job, and that is enough for me. He starts with humility. He ends with humility. This man named Job had everything the world could ever offer and it was all taken away without explanation. And he sat silent day upon day upon day, and he received silence from his Creator day after day after day. And then when God speaks, and if you're following along in the reading plan, you'll get to the message that God has for Job this week, and it's profound. If you haven't read it in a while, you sit and just like, okay, God has spoken. And Job's story finishes with humility. Listen to what it says in Job chapter 42, verse 2. Spoken directly to God as if it's a prayer. Just listen to these words. I know that you can do all things. True. And that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Also true. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? I don't know. Therefore, I've uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. I should have kept quiet. Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you make it known to me. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes sees you. Therefore, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. We see this book conclude with an exemplary confession of humility. And I just love that line. I've heard of you, God. I heard about you. I've heard stories of you. I've seen the ways you've worked. I've watched from a distance, but now I've seen you face to face because of a season of silence, because of a willingness for you to stay silent. Let me get all the junk out of my heart to stand before you now, overwhelmed by the character and the power and the goodness of God. I won't speak anymore. I'm going to stay silent because now I've seen God. And this interaction, you guys, is so profound. This moment that he has with God is so monumental that it begs the question, how did Job get here? How did he get to that point where he could say that? He got there because of silence. And at the end of the story, what I love is God doesn't condemn Job's questions. He doesn't fault him for asking. And one of the messages we receive as you kind of read this is you realize it's okay to ask. It's okay to vent. God can take it. His goodness, his justice, his motive will not be defined by your inability to understand it. So go on and question. Go on and ask. God can take it. He's strong enough. His shoulders are broad enough to hold every bit of your pain and your questions in the journey. And we may never know the motive or the mind of God, but in his silence, we may examine our own mind and our own motive toward him, which can bring healing. And I hope that we finish our life on earth as Job finished his, having been tested and approved. Listen to the final verse in the book of Job, verse 17. After he'd been given back all the blessings, double, God gave it all back after this season of trying. He's received everything back. And at the end of his life, in verse 17, says, Job died an old man and full of days. I pray that that's my story as I listen to God in silence. Father, thank you for slowly and carefully revealing truth to us as we can take it. Lord, there's so much we can't comprehend, so much we can't understand, that if you tried to reveal every detail about the universe and humanity and how our world worked, we would not be able to absorb it all. We would not be able to comprehend. It would be too lofty, too complex. We are not capable of understanding the mind of God. So would we learn from the silence of Job's friend and show up for others? We learn from the silence of God and recognizing it's okay to share, it's okay to spew, it's okay to dump. Sometimes we just need to say it out loud. We learn from the silence of Job and recognizing you are the creator and sustainer of the universe. Incomprehensible is your ways, so we'll just sit silent before you in humility. Speak to us in the silence, Lord. In your name I pray. Amen. Let's, just before you stand and we finish our service and worship, let's just sit for 20, 30 seconds, just in silence before God. And we'll break the silence with singing something true, singing a prayer. But let's just become silent before him for a minute.